Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be C-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear: security isn't negotiable. It's a top priority.
Be careful that you don't create oppressive surveillance structures where you suddenly say, I can now trace for everyone. What did he actually do between 10:12 o'clock and 10:13? Not having MFA is not a solution. But to say I'm implementing MFA and the problem is solved, I don't believe that at all. Maybe I can define roles, after which access is then provided by default. What we keep seeing there is that over time, the organization will have more roles when they have identities.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Security Chef, the podcast. In the new year, the first episode right away features a special guest. And for everyone who doesn't know you yet, no, just kidding. Even in the new year, there's a new greeting. So I'm happy to have you, Tobias, on the call today. And tell us, Tobias, who are you?
Yes, I'd love to. So I'm Tobias Lieberum, one of the founders of CyberDesk. CyberDesk is a Munich-based cybersecurity startup that aims to make it easier to track who can and should actually access which data from our own experience, but also from the statistics, that right now it's an incredible challenge to really track on a data level, which identities can actually do what in my instance. I have the really, really great ones, IAM tools. They give me tables with my users, my groups, my roles, but somewhere in the table, it just stops. And on the flip side, I have the data security tools that might give me nice lists of my sensitive data, but it just stops there. And what we've experienced time and again is that it's incredibly difficult to track. How do I bring these two silos, these security silos together? And who can actually do what in my organization? And that can definitely be a huge problem. If I just take the statistics and, for example, listen to Microsoft, more than 95% of access permissions are not used at all. And at the same time, 80% of all successful cyber attacks from one identity in one way or another, then I have an incredibly toxic combination, where on one hand, the identities, whether they are human or non-human identities, we need to talk about that, what differences we actually see there. If you consider identities as the weakest link in the chain, and at the same time, the identities are overprivileged. And then in the end, I just need to have a single identity that gets compromised for whatever reason. And bam, I have a potentially disastrous impact on my organization. And to solve the problem, and that's what we've set out to do. And yes, that's a very, very exciting field. It's really a lot of fun.
You already mentioned it, identities. Today we have something really special because you are the first guest with whom we are doing the new format, Deep Dive. Let's do it. So we really don't want to just scratch the surface, but rather dive deep into the topic. And I want to give a spoiler alert now. Please excuse me if I mispronounce one or another word, or rather twist it around, because right now authenticity and authentication and all these other topics with it, I find it really difficult. So please excuse that. But before we start with all the A's, we already began talking about identities. I think we should start our deep dive there. What are entities anyway? I just know usernames, passwords, certificates, tokens. What kinds of identities do you know?
I think that's at least historically developed. Those are still the very, very important criteria. But interestingly, the field is becoming more and more colorful. It keeps going, so one can really argue about it quite well, what all belongs in there. I think that's where you can traditionally agree, definitely the human identities. These can be my internal employees. Those can be my external partners. But they can also be my customers. And I somehow already have 3 interesting groups when it comes to human identities. In addition, I increasingly have all the non-human identities. So classically, there are some service accounts, but also machine identities in the IT sector. Increasingly, of course, when we talk about digitalization, more and more in the IoT and OT areas. So I have a field that is expanding, that is becoming increasingly confusing and at the same time extremely sensitive. I mean, this cliche statement, this new perimeter, the new defense wall in the cloud age, is really the identities. Because if I had put a fence around my server in the past and could ensure it was somewhat secure, no one literally gets over this physical fence, then I was somewhat well positioned. And that doesn't work anymore in the cloud age. And that's why this is a really, really exciting field for the future, where I believe a lot is happening and where you can also shape a lot.
When we talk about identities, as you just mentioned, there are human identities and there are machine identities, which I also see quite often, especially in terms of forensics, because that's what interests the attackers. Of course, there are also the privileged identities, things like admin accounts and root access. Do you see a real distinction there to say, okay, you should look at them separately? Because I also often hear this topic, these privileged accounts. That's kind of a story from the past. These days, people talk less about privileged accounts and more about user concepts. How do you see that in your everyday life? Does that still exist?
I think you always have to distinguish between buzz and reality, but it is certainly the case that we say we want to focus on using AI right now. For example, using data more and more, empowering more and more people in business functions with data to work. But this naturally leads to an increasing distribution of permissions across the identities. And this very, very classic, I have a privileged access session that I can log into beforehand, where I can say, this is the time window, I can document that. What's happening? Of course, I still have that for regulatory reasons. But to say, I only focus on that and leave all other identities out of the picture, I believe this leads to being compliant on paper, but not necessarily secure, because we have these increasingly all-around users who accumulate a crazy amount of permissions they need or don't need, but who might slip through the cracks of privilege access management.
But that's exactly right. Sorry to interrupt you. Where you said this privilege access, most people aren't even aware of it. So that's really the case right now. When we talk about identities, these privileged permissions still exist because you can't really get through a lot of things. Then let's say other systems, will talk more about that later, that you can also use two-factor authentication or whatever else to authorize these privileged identities differently or to make them more secure. You will always want and need to work with these privileged identities because you need them. Yes, admin accounts, you definitely need privileged access. There's really no other way because the systems demand that as well. And I believe, and that's why I want to wrap this up briefly. Also, from the statement I made, we will still have to work with privileged identities. I believe, however, that the perspective on these privileged identities is different from what it was 5 years ago.
100%. And I mean, you can also look into privileged identities. We need to take a look, whether we'll have time later. You can also see some really exciting progress there. So, for example, what we're currently working on, what I'm saying is, if I have to document the sessions in the PAM area, why am I actually doing that in an exaggerated way, said with pencil and paper? I have all the logs, and I actually have a use case for LLMS that can really help me to relieve this manual documentation work, that I can track the activities, automated translation into a language that is understandable for human users. And I believe that beyond the buzz, beyond the hype, there is a very, very interesting use case for LLMs where real value is being created.
But now I want to jump back in with the German mentality that I always hear about when it comes to identities. You probably know it too, namely the topic Works Council, monitoring of employees. How is that compliant with it? So if you now say, okay, yes, there are ways to track and monitor that more closely, especially user activities and login behavior and so on, I often see a topic where there's this gap between I have to monitor it to ensure security, but I'm actually not allowed to monitor it because in the end, it's employee monitoring. It's always there.
100%. Interestingly, it's actually a topic that I encounter mainly in the German-speaking area. And I believe it's a very, very important topic because it's obviously extremely sensitive. Technology can always be misused. And of course, this is the solution area where you have to be extremely careful that you don't create oppressive surveillance structures where suddenly you say, I can now track everyone. What did he actually do between 10, 12, 10, 13 o'clock? On the other hand, there are indeed, occasionally there are hard reasons to need this information very urgently and very precisely. For example, if I find out that I'm learning about a breach that in the worst case happened 6 weeks ago, and now I have to trace it back as quickly as possible, which data is affected. So NIST 2 states, for example, that I have to have everything understood within 72 hours, documented and reported. then I don't want to start digging through log faults first. But then I want to be able to trace it back relatively quickly. Man, what was the reality actually? What really happened? And I think that's the charm of it, that when you think about it together and not against each other, there can be an excellent solution. So what works well, for example, is that you say, if there is such a case, and I urgently need to trace it back for an important security reason, what happened? Then it is certainly also in the interest of the Works Council to clarify this information quickly, to avoid penalties, to prevent damage to the company that ultimately creates jobs. And then, after approval by the Works Council, for example, this information can be released. I believe there are good solutions how that can be done. Interestingly, I was just talking the other day with a DAX board member who actually found it quite an interesting question from the Works Council's perspective. Who can actually access something? Because the Works Council also wants to ensure that it goes in the other direction. Works, and also the Works Council, has visibility. Are sensitive data really only accessible to those who should have it?
I believe that communication is the most important topic everywhere in security, just to share information. Why do you need that? And then I've never had a Works Council before who said somehow, no, that's not going to work. It is, of course, in the very own interest of a Works Council to protect the employees. And unfortunately, there are also negative examples of companies that have monitored their employees. And so I believe this is also a story again, usability versus security balance, which also needs to be taken into account. But now we've kind of strayed a bit from the topic. I would like to go back to the basics for a moment. And now comes what I already announced earlier, namely my hated word, authentication and authorization. Let's continue discussing that. Authentication is very clear to me. Who are you? This password, fingerprint, some kind of authentication. So that you know, okay, that's me. Do you also see that for yourself when you look back at the past? Now looking towards the future, is there also a movement in that area? So many people are now also asking me about the topic of passkeys. Are you using that? Do you take that? What do you see in the market? Is there a movement in this area right now? How to deal with identities better? How to better deal with identities, or what options do we have to handle identities better?
I believe it's an extremely exciting field because there have been a lot of incidents related to it in the past. So if we take Snowflake, everyone would have had MFA enabled. It might still have happened that we had this famous Snowflake bridge incident, but it might not have been quite as severe. Not as many organizations and not as much data would have been affected. So I keep seeing that when you talk to organizations, they say, hey, we've just implemented MFA. Now everyone is starting to talk about it. They say, hey, we've just implemented MFA. Now everyone is starting to talk about it. Is MFA still the right choice? And am I really safe with it? In our opinion, it's very clear. Having MFA is better than not having MFA. Just saying I'm implementing MFA in whatever form, how secure it is. There are also different levels. I implement it and say that solves the problem. It's a false sense of security. Exactly. Exactly right. It's really, really exciting to talk about pragmatic solutions. I'm using Google Authenticator. That's the difficulty. The codes will, if you don't turn it off, be proactively synced to the cloud. And there have already been known breaches that occurred because of this, that only a single employee accidentally gave access to his Google workspace to a seemingly legitimate service employee through social engineering. And since those codes were traceable, the authentication through Google Authenticator could be bypassed. So saying I have MFA and I'm safe with it is by no means the solution.
I believe that with MFA, and I'm speaking now, from my personal experience, I still have the problem with usability. So I use, for example, and this is not an advertisement, whether it's good or bad, everyone has to take it for themselves. For example, I use Cisco Duo. I once got an account for 3 years ago when I was still working a lot with Cisco at the old company. I once got an account for free, and I have to say it's a really cool story. I can store all my so-called passkeys there, as well as handle the whole multi-factor code generation and so on. The problem is, depending on which attacker you have, sometimes they want Google, sometimes they want Microsoft, sometimes he has some proprietary system that doesn't work at all with Cisco Duo. Sometimes this code works, sometimes it doesn't. Well, I really have to say, go in from a usability perspective. I have the problem that I'm trying as best as I can with every website or application that I have to authenticate with two-factor. It's about every website or every application that I have to authenticate with two-factor. I have to authenticate myself with two-factor, and also not to do two-factor via SMS. You can also share your experiences right away, because I find two-factor SMS, if you really want to get access, it's the easiest because you can just clone it if you already have access to someone. then cloning the number, or they try to get to the data through phishing. It's easier than using an app, right? But my problem in everyday life is actually that there is no standardized approach. One person works with Google, another works with this, and another works with that. And that's a bit difficult. And for me, it also makes it it increases the potential for frustration. To say, yeah, well, why should I even bother with two-factor authentication at all?
No, 100%. I just counted in my head how many different authentication solutions I actually have on my phone while you were talking. You have to say, when you think about it, both in the business sector and in the private sector, a lot comes together because it really isn't easy to bundle everything together, to centralize it. The individual solutions, I have also used Duo in the past. I didn't find that bad per se, but it does lead to you having more pop-ups. You have tools that say, give me this access, give me that access, give me this access. And especially when that happens quickly one after the other, I think it's only human that you might accidentally hit yes a bit too often in case of doubt. And maybe by chance you just wanted to give access yourself. I thought it didn't go through, and bam. Second attempt was harmful. And just like that, you've got a problem. So I believe that's the very clear message. Not having MFA is not a solution, but to say I'm implementing MFA and the problem is solved. I don't think that's the case at all. But what's interesting, in my opinion, is to ask what's coming next. And of course, there are different solutions. How can I make my MFA stronger? Whether it's passkeys or other physical methods to prove something I have, something I know, we all know it. Or whether it's about saying these two worlds. Now I have to stutter myself. Authentication and authorization. Are they really going to be two different worlds in the future, or are they going to increasingly blend together? If we don't come to a solution in the ideal world where they are closely intertwined, and I don't just have the MFA authentication as a factor, but many surrounding factors as well when it comes to granting access.
What I also see there, especially on the topic of two-factor authentication. For example, there's a very natural need. You might just change your phone, a natural need. For example, you just change your phone. Best example, I just got a new phone contract. I get a new phone. And now I'm actually facing the challenge again. How I stand every time. The good thing about Cisco Duo is that they also have a cloud storage feature, which I don't use, but you always have to keep an eye on it. That the things you have stored on this device are transferred to the new device. The best example is still this. No advertising against it or any bashing against it. But at my wife's savings bank, for example, when she gets a new phone, she always has to go to the savings bank to activate her new phone. I absolutely find this a pain in the ears topic. Why can't you do that somehow via SMS or whatever? And of course, the topic of security at a bank is something completely different than when I sign up for a website XY. I can understand that too. In the end, that's just how it is. You have to go there and it's like this. But I also believe that all these identity topics we've already mentioned, especially the topic of authentication and also authorization, in this regard, we've learned quite a bit about usability in the past. Can we also learn from attacks? What can be done there? And I believe that's the big challenge, always looking, how do you create a better balance in between? For me, my personal opinion is still very much focused on security. It has to be security and only security. But if I go to my wife now and say, set up two-factor authentication for me, for example, email or whatever, then she just gets really annoyed. So she doesn't know that I want to embarrass her with this. She knows that too. We've talked about this quite a bit already because she always says, yeah, well, what advantage do I get from that? And I believe that's also a topic, especially when we come back to the business world with multi-factor. Many companies just roll it out like that and say, we're now implementing multi-factor. And then the employees suddenly face this issue. And I've also learned that personally, in projects, do it really in chunks. Don't do it all at once, but maybe do it by departments. By departments? And does it really take people by the hand or tell them, why are we doing this? So why is this so important? And not like that? Yes. We need security now because it's independent. Also, regarding the topic of two-factor authentication, it's all about security. If you explain it properly and also trust the people with it, then you have greater acceptance than if you just impose it from above.
These are all people. And I mean, I think that's interesting from any perspective. That's interesting from the perspective of the employees. But that's interesting from the perspective of IT security experts, because I can now say I have MFA activated everywhere. Then there's a green check mark and I feel secure. But exactly that question you mentioned. How can I manage the different devices, for example, that could potentially be used for MFA purposes? How can I keep track of them? How can I ensure someone there 30 years and use several MFA tools? How can I ensure the right MFA devices are used? And having used several MFA tools, how can I actually ensure that only the right MFA devices are being used? I think there are a lot of exciting areas to explore there, that only the right MFA devices are actually being used. I think there are a lot of exciting areas to explore where technological advancements will improve support for the teams.
Let's move on to the second A. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly again. Namely, the topic of authorization. It's mainly about what you're allowed to do, certain accesses, so to speak. Do I have the permission for them or do I not? I often see it like that too. So employees, they don't always do it. With full awareness, sometimes it's just out of curiosity. Look, folder, click on it. Vacation photos or payslips and so on. So I often see that topic as well. Many companies say, yes, I have to protect myself, that an unauthorized person gains access to it. But I see that too. You have to protect yourself from that. That someone who accidentally accesses it can't access it either. So sure, unauthorized access is one thing, but the other is that someone who suddenly found a way in. And more, I learned that employees can be very creative. So if there's one thing I've had to learn repeatedly in the company, in all possible areas, if there's ever a wall somewhere, employees always find some way around it. Creative ways to get around that wall. And that also highlights why this topic is so important. This topic of authorization, where you really have to take a look, okay, how do I manage to do that to set it up cleanly? And above all, how do I make that transparent?
100%. A very, very interesting field. There are statistics that about a third of all successful breaches come from insiders in some form. And it can really just be human curiosity. In case of doubt, it could also be well-meaning curiosity, where I think, hey, this could be a data set that is relevant to me to solve a certain problem. That's relevant to me to solve a certain problem. And I just take a look at it and bam, I might have seen something like that. Whatever, in the simplest case, just in quotes, just for compliance reasons, a problem is, or in the worst case, it actually is a security problem. And getting a handle on that. I believe it's anything but trivial, because right now, when we think about Copilot, it only gets worse, which is what we have tried to do in the past. That is to say, this person who is just clicking around out of boredom and looking here and there, if I make the titles of my data, my files, sufficiently vague so that it's not clear at all that this is, for example, compensation or something like that, then the effort to click through all the permissions and accidentally find something that isn't meant for me becomes very, very high. But if I now use a Copilot who has all those permissions and I ask the Copilot, what does my boss earn? Then the Copilot could, in the worst case, give me that answer pretty quickly. What wasn't meant for me was very, very high. But if I now use a Copilot who has all those permissions and I ask the Copilot, what does my boss earn? Then the Copilot could, in the worst case, give me that answer pretty quickly. So I believe this topic will become even more complicated, even more difficult in the future.
I think that's also a bit of the fear that many have about AI. I mean, we are ourselves also Microsoft partners, and they do a lot with Copilot. And I keep hearing from companies that it's a bit like, yeah, either they find it really fancy to work with Copilot, or they say, no, let's not do that because we don't really know what's behind it. And that's really super important. As you already said, just pay attention to the permissions. You can easily bypass that issue. No, in the end, it doesn't really matter. Such models can then also access things where the regular employee might not have access to it. But what I also see there, of course, it's the development that has also emerged in that area. If we assume that you also get other types, how you can be authorized, no. For example, now also about sessions and token IDs, right? And I believe that it's also important to understand or to know how to deal with it. Which method do I use for my authorization? Do you see that as a very important part?
Extremely, extremely. And there we can also see a certain development when you say, at the beginning, I somehow had the choice to be very, very liberal and say everyone gets exaggeratedly access to everything. Or I can say there's always a manual approval process for everything. Neither of those is good. One thing is if everyone is allowed to do everything, I have maximum freedom, but also maximum uncertainty. If I say I have to request approval for everything, I find myself in a situation where I am completely paralyzed as an organization. And that can lead to the point where I, as an administrator, quickly say, here comes another one to annoy me. I approve it in case of doubt. It should be fine. Or I, as a user, am interested in something and might not go through the official channel, but rather can just be my buddy from the neighboring department, whether he can unlock something for me. I think that's absolutely human. It's not inherently morally wrong, but it is, of course, a disaster for either the security or the dynamics of an organization.
I just have one more question about that, something I'm still curious about. From your perspective, do you still see the need to know principle as the standard?
So for compliance and security reasons, I personally find that very, very desirable. Even if we only take the GDPR, I basically have to be able to explain for every data record, why could someone access it? And if I can't explain that, I'm already not compliant. And prosecutor, in case of doubt, doesn't say, yeah, it was a lot of work, but rather says, hey, you could have handled it differently. That's your problem now. So in my opinion, 100% see it differently.
I don't see it differently, but I often feel that this need to know principle has been somewhat diluted, but not because it was done intentionally, but rather because one has lost track. What should that person even be able to see or be allowed to see? Especially this topic of role definition, I often see as the area where the need to know principle can be somewhat bypassed because the role hasn't been clearly defined.
100%. I mean, that's basically just a trick in this tension between I have to request everything or I get everything approved to say, hey, maybe I can define roles, after which access is made available by default. What we keep seeing there is that over time, the organization has more roles than it has identities. Is that over time, the organization has more roles than it has identities, which basically renders the whole concept absurd. No roles to avoid manual work. What roles do I have and who can actually do what? Then I'm back in that situation where I can basically assign and pull things for everyone manually. It's just as complex and just as uncertain. So it's basically not a sustainable solution. If it is purely based on statically defined roles, and I actually see that too, again, beyond the basics, to say a reasonable use case, man, that's something where AI can help us to dynamically allocate these roles just in time. So I can say, I take my policies where a role concept is defined, where I say someone from the finance department with this title, this and that is allowed. I take the history of access and can say that someone accessed it once a week, or someone only accesses it every 12 months, but always right around the performance evaluation and the like. So I can recognize this pattern, which is no longer manageable for humans given the sheer volume of data, but actually processing with a customer is, I can look at similar role profiles and say, someone with the same job title, someone from the same department has the same access rights, yes or no, and bring all these factors together. And I think that's exactly where authentication and authorization blur and merge, because I want to understand very precisely who actually is the identities that you are currently pretending to be, that is currently accessing, possibly also from Mauritius, because maybe this employee is working diligently from vacation, or because they are compromised. And how can I make that decision so securely that the AI relieves me and tells me this is most likely safe, that's most likely unsafe? I think that's a really, really interesting use case.
You're also bringing up a topic that I've seen time and again, also in relation to insider activities, the topic of the join the mobile lever process. So that's where I've seen it time and again. Where the mistakes happen is, or rather where people could break out, because a classic example, you have someone who works in marketing today, leaves the marketing department and goes to IT, for example. It's such a simple example. Then it is like this. There has to be a transition phase. In most companies, that's how it is. He still needs further access to his marketing area, but he already gets authorization for the IT area. And exactly these overlapping points, either this overlap lasts a very long time or, in quotes, is no longer resolved. I see that quite often too, that he still retains both rights, or that this overlapping phase is simply so long that in the end he retains authorization for a long period. I often see this problem in companies, that this join and move and leave process is not clearly defined. And that's where I can also feel outbursts.
100%. That's why we founded Cyberless back then, because we had that experience ourselves. That's an incredibly tough nut to crack. And it's especially a tough nut to crack because it's incredibly difficult to first gain visibility. Where am I actually having problems? So the trainee or intern who goes through all the departments, it's this famous example where someone suddenly has more permissions than the CEO. And that's mainly because it's incredibly hard to understand which identities does that apply to. By the way, we can talk about that right away, not just for human identities, but this is also very, very important for machine identities that someone set up at some point where 10 years later, no one knows anymore. What did we set them up for? It's not well documented. What do they do? What breaks down? If I turn them off, I'd rather let them keep running in case something goes wrong because I removed them. And those are actually very, very complex points where I can now say, I can just throw a simple access review on it if it's only at the account level. This leads to people saying, like, yeah, I still need that account somewhere. That the depth within my Microsoft 365 requires some granular permission changes. I didn't solve that with this. And conversely, we as humans also have the tendency to say, yeah, that's a project I worked on 2 years ago. But that was an interesting analysis back then. Maybe I can recycle that someday. I better keep that. And I believe that the only solution there is to clean things up and create greater security. Really applying a technology to manage the complexity to get a handle on it.
And what I also have to say very clearly is that an audit needs to be conducted. Unfortunately, far too few companies do that, to really sit down once a year or every 2 years and take a good look at things. Who has what permissions? And that really sounds as harsh as it is. There are various tools and different ways to really take a closer look at this, or to have such a process that it just needs to be confirmed again. For example, I also have Mal. I introduced a permission management system for a client where we said, look, permissions need to be reassigned twice a year. They are all automatically revoked and need to be reassigned to simply break out of this rut, to simply have the corresponding security. And I think that's forgotten many who keep telling themselves, yes, we need a permanent improvement process. Yes, we need to reassess ourselves accordingly every year. People think a lot, but very few think about identities.
And I find what you just said to be a very, very interesting point. I think what's crucial is to really say, I'm so radical that I actually revoke the permissions. And I say, hey, if you still need them, then they'll be reallocated now. That's obviously incredibly tedious for the organization because in the worst case, I have to say from your experience, it can certainly lead to that I first have an interruption because people no longer have the permissions. But if I play the reverse scenario saying, I'll send you a list and ask you, do you still need this permission? Yes or no? Then it's of course very, very human, very natural to say, oh, come on, it's a shame not to have a single permission anymore. I'll click on yes. I find that extremely interesting that you say really revoke radically. That's crazy.
So in the end, it was a learning process, and it ended up happening that way, that some people couldn't work, but after 2 times it was perfect. So I think that's also, so this comfort zone where you always want to think about things, do I want it this way or do I not want it this way? Yes, there are always, when you introduce it once, there are always points of friction because of course someone forgets this, someone didn't do that, and so on. But for us, that was the case after the second time, so to speak, we did it twice. Yeah. The following year, no one had any problems anymore because everyone knew, okay, at the time you arrive, this query has already been done beforehand, had already been processed beforehand, had already requested the permission beforehand, and so on. So in the end, it was just a pure process thing. And all of this came about because of that, because unfortunately of unauthorized permissions, and due to a bad one in the JoyD mobile delivery process, data was leaked. As they had individuals filing lawsuits, it was painful for the company. They said we must learn from this. Now they are fully on board with the process. Okay, now we all have to learn from this somehow. And as of today, I can say that they are absolutely on board with the process.
Exciting. And what do you see as the next step? Is the next step to say all permissions will be even more time-based? So to say that's actually 6 months. Would you say the next step is to say even shorter and ideally really just for the time when it's needed? Or do you think that's not feasible where it's needed? Or do you think that's not feasible?
I believe the next step for them has to be to delve more into the topic of role management. Not that for them, there was always the problem. They had a lot of individual permissions. That's why this radical step was necessary, because you couldn't just distribute it through a role-based permission, but really have a lot of individual permissions, some special permissions, things that somehow felt like no one knew about anymore. There wasn't really an owner for the applications who could say, you can do this, you can't do that. And especially for this company, I would say the next important step is really to get into a role concept, to get into role calculation. You can't, and especially for this company, I would say the next important step is really to get into a role concept, to get into role calculation. And then I think this time frame of 6 months is also completely sufficient for that, because you don't change a role that often, I would say. There might be 1 or 2 companies where you might change your role every 6 months, but usually that's not the case. Changes every 6 months, but usually that's not the case. And I think that's it there. The goal is to move away from individual permissions towards role-based permissions.
Exciting. And I think that's actually something, again, where we need new solutions. Because when I picture it, it's basically like a tree. I can go from the individual identity all the way to the data record. And that's going to branch out now more and more over the roles, branching out through the groups, through the permissions. To understand that, I can't just cut down the whole tree, but I really have to say somewhere, what are the branches, the old ones, the rotten ones, the unused ones? What can I cut out of there? Without the whole tree dying, I think that's the big challenge.
Absolutely. And I think what you also need to see here, I always say this in the security field, there is never 100% solution, and there is also never a right or wrong solution. You always have to see that in the context of the company. And for them, that was a good solution. For some other companies, people are currently banging their heads in their hands and saying, Nico, what are you actually talking about? That would be the absolute worst case scenario for us. You just have to see how it fits the company.
Yes, 100%. However, I believe I can say that I have great respect for the complexity of the topic, and that's why I'm not doing anything at all. I believe that's not a sustainable strategy. I often hear people say, wow, it's so complex for us. I'd rather not touch that hot iron. And I believe that really only works for so long until something happens. And when something happens, no one will say, was complex, was hot, but then it just gets hot and we should have done it. Yes, I agree with you.
You definitely have to do something, and every way to do more is definitely a better way than just closing your eyes and saying it'll be fine. Because we know from experience, there are so many issues that have already happened. It's definitely a better way than just closing your eyes and saying it'll be fine, because we know from experience, there are so many issues that have already happened. And in the end, it's a huge effort to think about it. And then in the end, with tools and support with your solution now that you developed, you have to come from the need to say, okay, let's do this right now. And I think taking that step to say, let's do this right now. It takes time, it costs money, and it requires effort, but it's not like you have to do this every year. And I think that's something you have to keep in mind. When you get started in that area, you know, that's how it starts. You start once, the investment is there once. The time is there, but in the end, it should just be a continuous improvement process that you regularly take a look at it and monitor it accordingly. You just have to improve the process at one screw or another.
Reinventing the wheel is unnecessary. Organizations face common IT challenges, but every organization, whether they're selling cars or bananas in a supermarket, faces similar core IT issues. In core IT, the problems are not fundamentally different. Of course, the use cases vary in each business sector, not fundamentally different. Of course, the use cases vary in each business sector, no question about it. But this core problem of saying, how can I actually set this up properly, is always relatively similar. And in that case, I can definitely bring in external support if needed from someone who has done it before, and just let someone help me by saying, how do I approach such a project? How can I manage this properly?
Let's move away from the topic of identities. We've been talking about identities for a long time now. I think everyone has understood a bit now. What are identities? What types are there? What methods are there to deal with identities? Let's take a look at the exciting topic now. Attack vectors and security risks of identities. If we now talk about classic attack vectors or classic attacks on identities, we've already touched on that. I'm familiar with the topic of phishing. I know about pass the hash, where you try to get hash values instead of passwords. I'm familiar with the topic of identity stuffing, which is the automated use of leaked identities. What are some things that you've come across, especially in relation to attack scenarios? How to get access to identities?
I think what is currently a very hotly debated topic is, in this whole area, I focused intensely in recent years on saying, how can I secure my human identities and possibly overlook all the non-human identities, where I don't do things like MFA and the like at all? No, I don't. And there are statistics. Some say there are 20 times as many non-human identities as there are human identities. Some say there are 40 times as many, whether that is 20 or 40. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, as we continue to digitize and automate more and more, I will have more and more machine identities in one form or another. These are at least just as sensitive. I will have more and more machine identities in one form or another that are at least just as sensitive, because they can go incredibly deep into my systems and don't have basic hygiene factors like MFA at all. So if I don't fully understand in the first step what I actually have on hand, when are they active? Do I still need them? Do I have any that haven't been active for 5 years, where I don't even know what I still have them for? And if I see any anomalies, then I have an incredibly large attack surface where I think, okay, I've turned on MFA. I'm actually sure and have completely overlooked half of my attack surface because of that.
I completely agree with you. I would also like to add to the topic of service accounts and technical users. Technical users were also a topic we included in the survey because that's often a topic I also see in forensic matters that has somehow been exposed because someone saw the technical user and the password in plain text in some program or file, and thus the technical user had administrative privileges or things like service accounts that are then used for services. I still see a big potential for attackers to gain quick access because these accounts are always completely under the radar.
And in the worst case, you have situations where the information has been shared, where you haven't documented anything in case of doubt. What human personalities inside and outside my organization know, because they know about all these accounts and may have long since left the organization, but still have access to it. First, create transparency to know my tasks is to create transparency in the first step, that I first clear the table and know what I need to take care of. And then to work through that step by step. And here we see again and again the issue of what exactly are the approval processes? When I set up new technical users, do I allow that for everyone? Or shouldn't I have a clear approval process, just like the access request I have for human users? Also, for all service accounts, all technical users, and all other non-human identities, we need to establish a very clear approval process so that they can be newly created at all.
Do you see a possibility in the future to completely do without these users?
That's interesting. I would even say that there will be more and more, in my opinion. So when we have this whole password bingo, like multi-agents and the like, that are supposed to take over routine tasks more and more. Interestingly, there's actually a lot to say in the IT and security field. Standard requests can already be handled quite well with multi-agents. It's all going to come down to that I create highly privileged non-human identities in one way or another that reach deep into my systems. If they are supposed to do something proactively, yes, very much so, have a lot of permissions. And in my opinion, quite the opposite. They will actually increase. What do you think about that?
I'm asking this in a provocative way because I recently had an interesting client, also with an audit from an external company that has made it their mission to be an expert in the field of identities. And what I've seen quite often that they showed him in their audit, look, we have this many technical users. The goal now is to get that out. I don't remember the exact number. I think it was 50 or so, to reduce 50 to 10. And I've seen that more often. In fact, in such audits, the goal is to really reduce the number of technical users, whether it has to do with wanting to simplify things so that there are fewer users who ultimately have the same task or the same permissions but have different responsibilities, or whether they really want to eliminate technical users. But I have actually often noticed that there is a declining trend in getting fewer users, how to get more users. That's why I wanted to ask you how you see it.
Yes, it's really fascinating. How do they do that technically? So you go from 50 down to 10. Do you then give each individual technical user more permissions? Or were the 50 technical users simply not necessary at all? Or what is the philosophy behind that?
So I think, as I understood it, was it really the case that they said, okay, they want to reduce it because you can simply give similar calculations to fewer technical users who can then implement that? And what I keep seeing with technical users, what many forget, technical users, for example, can also be prevented from logging in at the console, that they are really just users who can run the services, for example. And I think now with that specific client, that was more the case. It felt like each service was given its own user and they wanted to centralize that.
I find it super interesting, especially from that perspective. So I would say reduce it and get down to 10 sounds extremely plausible without having more context. But what happens if one of the 10 who might be highly privileged gets compromised? So am I really reducing my attack surface by doing that? I find it extremely interesting. We should definitely hear more about that.
Yes, and I think that's also the topic, especially when we talk about service accounts. We also need to discuss shadow IT. I believe that shouldn't be overlooked either, because this is exactly the issue, that many IT departments are not aware of all the services. There we have the topic of transparency again. I mean, in the OT area, I don't want to open that can of worms. That's a whole different problem. When it comes to the topic of transparency, but I also see that more and more in the IT sector, that any companies, whether it's a small business, a medium-sized company, or even a large corporation, often dive into this topic, diving into shadow IT?
Yes, it's a huge topic in itself. Also in the various forms, sure, OT, but the whole SaaS world is just incredible. How the numbers are growing exponentially. When it comes to the use of SaaS solutions, if they, for example, are not purchased under the enterprise license and therefore do not offer single sign-on, then it's a complete mess trying to get a handle on these various shadow solutions. 100%.
Do you see a development here, especially when we look to the future, especially AI? I know it's always the best words. Everyone is throwing around AI. But do you think that AI can also help bring the issue of shadow IT more under control?
Yes, but I believe we need to separate the hype from the hard facts. So, for example, in the past, there have definitely been attempts with robotic process automation, basically small if you will, bots. It's a problem that I don't have single sign-on. I still want to quickly revoke access to get a handle on it. And it has shown that it's way too static because you only need some small change in your tool and already the robotic process automation doesn't work. I'm already convinced of that with the advancements, especially in the LLM area, then one, artificial intelligence is capable of understanding that's the deviation in the flow, and that needs to change. To still achieve my goal, I definitely see significant progress in the next 3 to 5 years. As for this whole multi-agency AI-supported coworker thing, does that mean there will be no more IT security teams in the future? I don't believe that at all. Quite the opposite. They will become even more important because they need to ensure that what the AI tells you is actually plausible and that it really makes my organization safer and doesn't lead to chaos.
You've already talked a lot about technology. I would say let's take the next step and talk about technology and frameworks. Whenever I talk about identities, whether it's with the customer or when I'm thinking about identities myself, I inevitably come to the topic of IAM and PAM. For everyone who might not recognize that yet, tell me, what is IAM? What is PAM?
I think you can definitely have a very good debate about that because the definitions can vary a bit from each vendor. What is now included under PAM and what is not part of it. I also believe that this separation will be outdated in the future. I somehow have an IAM for the non-risky world and a PAM for the sensitive world. I believe that's an outdated silo mentality because it's ultimately a continuum from increasingly risky to less risky. What accesses and identities I have in my organization, but this fundamental consideration of saying that there are meetings that are particularly sensitive that need to be particularly documented, or there are access permissions that I can't just unlock with a password or MFA, but where I really need to be sure. It has to be a documented privileged access session. The reality will always continue to exist. And I believe our goal as those responsible for security should be very clear in saying we need to lower the mindset of a PAM as much as possible, that as many accesses and identities as possible fall into the privileged area. Because in fact, each of us increasingly has privileged access. And at the same time, to do it in a way that doesn't paralyze my organization. And that's what is really difficult, which is not trivial to implement.
And now it's always like this for me, especially the topic of IAM and PAM, as you already mentioned, are best words for me, because there are many manufacturers who just label their products. We are IAM or PAM manufacturers and we provide these and those functions. For me, that's my definition of it. And IAM is more like a framework for me, which ensures that only authorized people or systems have access to resources. So C here says it quite simply. And a PAM is for me just like that. A bit of this topic just in time. So how can someone with administrative rights be recorded just in time, checked, or have the session appropriately taken along? That's my definition.
Would I agree 100%? But I think, again, the most crucial thing is if I know it's a critical session and I'm managing it through my PAM, that's great. And there are also very, very good solutions to clean that up. The big danger, in my opinion, is understanding what are the IAM areas in the PAM? What about the more IAM application areas that I need to manage in the PAM? And if I now think about that, for example, when I think about the cloud and see that the permission concepts offered by each of these solution providers are so complex. So in the ABS, I have a few dozen different permissions that are all very granularly controlled. Who is actually allowed to do what? But what does that actually mean, whether it's a deletion right, a create right, or just a read right? I really need to be extremely familiar with that to understand that. And if I don't have visibility, then in case of doubt, I can't say for sure, hey, that would probably have been a pump case. Probably not.
Let's move on to the next buzzword that we keep hearing about, zero trust. How does zero trust fit with identities?
I mean, we've all been struggling with this for years to make the zero trust reality happen, and somehow it just doesn't seem to be working. And I think the interesting question again is, where is the actual problem? Why isn't it working? That if I no longer have a local network where I can exert some control, but in the extreme case, I have a global organization that links into my data from anywhere in the world, links into my systems, I think there's no question that I need zero trust. The tough nut to crack is figuring out how I can actually implement that in a scalable way. And that is still the case today, I would say, only achieved to a certain extent. What do you think about that?
For me, the tough nut to crack is understanding what everyone understands by zero trust. That's definitely the most important thing because, as I said, for me, it just feels like everyone uses it in some way. So for AI, it was zero trust. For me, the biggest buzzword, everyone has somehow written that down. Now everyone is putting AI on everything. Before it was still blockchain. So for me, those are the three top buzzwords that everyone just implements differently. I believe now in relation to identities, what zero trust means is very clear to me. Access rights should be constantly reviewed. So I can't trust that in that sense. And I need some kind of policy that also takes into account devices, location, and user behavior in some form. It covers everything to also say, okay, look, it's also possible to understand that something is different there as it was before. So especially this user behavior analysis, or whatever you want to call it in modern terms, is about making it possible to take a look. Is this behavior to be expected?
100%. I think that's it. From a vendor's perspective, I'm not entirely innocent myself. It's quite human to say, I'm defining a new category to somehow present myself in a completely new way. I think the crucial question is always, what do I want to achieve with all of this? And that's when you really get to the problem-solving part, saying, how can I make it happen? I don't want to trust anyone. I want to constantly verify while also keeping my organization alive and not paralyzing people at the same time. Also, those who don't live a human identity, how do I get there? I think that's the really exciting topic.
Now we've talked a lot about the past and the future. Let's take a look at the future of identities. We've also talked about what AI can already do. And I think once again here, AI is a great help. Things, especially the huge lists where there are permissions that need to be processed and checked automatically to analyze behavior or to predict risks as well. Where do you see the biggest strength in the area of AI right now, or what do you see AI strongest, especially in the area of identities?
I think it's really, really crucial to first consider what actually falls under AI for us. And that's exactly it. In the area of, for example, machine learning, it's by no means the development now fundamentally new, but the advanced statistics that we refer to as advanced analytics that we have increasingly integrated into machine learning. They have been working on that for quite some time. And at the same time, the scientific literature clearly states that the problem is still not 100% solved. And I see there are great advances to say, I am increasingly able to analyze large, complex data sets well and make decisions based on that. Whether I then say as a user, I trust the AI or I still want to keep an eye on it, that's beside the point. And I believe the reality is that people make mistakes. AI makes mistakes. In the end, it's a trade-off of who makes more mistakes. And I do believe that AI will increasingly, unfortunately, surpass us humans in that regard, because ideally it acts hyper-rationally and standardized, while humans tend to make more exceptions. And I see very clearly in that area that AI is increasingly relieving us. What's really exciting now is to say, if I also have the LLMs there, so they can also bring in text comprehension and say, okay, I have deviations from my policies, or suddenly I have things that I can additionally automate with AI agents. That's currently a hot topic. I think then we enter a really exciting field where the question is, how can let's take a concrete case. I did an access review. I have determined that these accesses are no longer necessary. Now I can sit down as a human and write articles, follow up, ask questions, listen, and say what's going on. Or I can say, hey, this is basically a topic that is very labor intensive, but relatively clearly structured. What do I actually want to work on? What do I want to achieve? And that I can achieve great progress with the combination of AI and humans working together and can really relieve the IT teams.
What I find to be an interesting topic, which I see time and again, is also this decentralized identities, DI. So the idea behind it is, for everyone who hasn't heard this yet, that, for example, is based on blockchain can manage their own sovereignty, identities, or can also assign everything to themselves accordingly. What do you think about the topic? I find that it's difficult because I think if we start at the base, for example, to consider who is allowed to do what first, so this role and permission concept, if we already have a problem there, how is that supposed to work if it should happen automatically?
100%. And I believe the whole topic of sovereign identities, especially when it comes to customers, is a huge topic in itself. You could probably make an entire podcast about it, is a huge topic in itself. You could probably make an entire podcast about that. If we just take a few smaller, lower level problems and ask what is the individual department who knows best in case of doubt, what do I need? What do I not need? Then I can already see that there is a great added value in saying, so delegate the decision about access as close to the use cases as possible, meaning as close to the decision makers as possible. But I also need to achieve the right sensitivity and training that the people in the departments know I really have to take care of it. And if something goes wrong, that's my problem. And I can't say everyone gets everything from me and it will be fine.
For me, this also includes the topic of, especially when we look at it. One is self-sovereignty, and the other is also without a central authority. At the end of the day, who decides that as well? So it has to be done in some form, then also through AI, or how this way doing things should be. A decision needs to be made, and I believe that's where it stops when security everywhere. If you start off with a 7 right away, but you don't have any sensors that can provide you with anything, the 7 doesn't really help you either. And I also believe that the foundation has to be right. And if the foundation is right, you can definitely do something. But I think that's more the problem, that many say, okay, we're doing this now, but they don't even look at the foundation and then they run into problems.
And you also have to think about human incentivization. So when I say I empower people to think for themselves, what do I need? Then it's only human to say, also give as much as possible and I'll see what I can make of it. Versus when I say I really want to make sure that nothing goes wrong, then I need to have those clean foundational structures in place. As you say,
maybe the last question for today, where do you see the trends in the next 5 years? So above all, what concerns you about your company? What are the future topics that you see in the next 5 years?
So on one hand, I see an industrial level, and of course I see a technical level. On the technical level, all these hypes say that when it comes to identities, there are also statistical identities. Gen AI and data security are, according to the 3 most important topics that are currently concerning those responsible for security. If identities are the most important issue, then the question is, how do I manage in times of staff shortages and increasing complexity? How do I actually design the control cleanly? And I believe that we will see extremely exciting technical advancements in that area. And at the same time, at the industry level, we are, of course, already seeing the fact that there are some great solutions available today. For example, in the USA, they are also building great solutions. They have a really great ecosystem. It's very, very exciting. But as it stands now, there are extremely few European solutions. And that there is a major shift in thinking happening, on one hand at the political level, and on the other hand at the user level, to say, hey, it's actually quite charming if I have something from next door, because then I have faster response cycles when I have a feature request. Doesn't it go to America? I don't hear anything for 3 years, and then it still doesn't come. But then I have contacts on site, and I have to say that's a great stroke of luck for us, really, as a startup, to see the wave of support to people who say, hey, that's refreshing. A software solution from the neighboring region. I can meet the people in person, and I can influence the roadmap in some way. And it's a very, very crucial element for me. What gets me up in the morning and makes me say, really cool job working with and watching cool people. How can we make users' everyday lives a little easier together?
I can only confirm that because we've already talked about the topic of OT. I don't want to see any spoilers right now. Maybe you'll see 1 or 2 things that we've discussed also soon in your system. I think it's also important to mention here, especially looking towards the future, it's always a growing topic or a constantly changing topic. You always have to think about that. And I also believe that once a company reaches a certain size, you can't avoid it. To get a management system for that, or to consider introducing something like that into a management system, because a lot happens with identities. There's a lot of change happening, and especially when it comes to the future, we've already talked about a lot of topics today. Does that change as well? And at some point, you just don't have the option to do that manually anymore.
100%. And I think that's crucial. We're all in the same boat. So, I mean, our discussion that we had bilaterally about the area, how can we actually think about identities in the OT sector? That's exactly the kind of thing, that's a problem somewhere that causes people a lot of anxiety in practice. And we can think together as an industry, how can we develop good solutions for that? And what else can we do? It's fun. I have to say.
Yes, thank you, Tobias, for taking the time today. It was basically the pilot episode for Deep Dive. Feel free to leave feedback in the comments about how you liked it. For everyone who has been here for the hour, who are still here, I would just throw the question into the chat or bring it up in the room. What identities are you using? Are you using MFA? Are you using PAM Zero Trust? Feel free to write it in the comments. I would be interested. I believe Tobias as well. If you have any more questions about that, Tobias' link is of course still included in the description. And so I would say that's it for this special episode. Deep dive on identities with Tobias. And we'll hear from each other next time. See you later. Thanks a lot, Nico. That was really cool. Great.